the Cool Innovation Research Group. Thank you for doing that. The Cool Innovation Research Group, called the Institute for Advanced Learning Technologies, or IALT. At least it's not a terrible acronym. Yeah, right? Sometimes they're sketchy. He is the director of investigating digital ecologies to advance transformative education, which is ID8 research lab. It's not an academic title, but it's really long, and we like long titles in academia. So he's rocking it. He's rocking it. He collects graduate degrees like infinity stones, because I mean, why not, right? He has a master's in instructional technology, another in project management, and he has a PhD in instructional technology as well. A couple other little things that you may or may not want to know about him. One of them, I'm going to have to question our friendship after this, is he likes to watch the 90 Day Fiance. That's, yeah. Questioning you and me, we'll talk later. But he is a mad expert air fryer and probably microwave maestro. So if you ever have a need to get something done quickly and you don't know how to make them chicken wings, just reach out to Dr. Moore. He will make sure that you have it done right. You don't burn it. You don't stank the house up like burnt popcorn. And that is my dear friend, Dr. Rob Moore. So I'll leave you with him.
Thank you very much for that. Don't knock my 90 Day Fiance fandom.
Not mocking, just saying, questionable.
It's the greatest television franchise there is right now, and that's not up for debate. That it's awesome. So let me share my slides. There we go. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. As Dr. Reese said, I was an instructional designer for 8 years at UNC Chapel Hill. And then I got a little bit frustrated with fighting with faculty all the time. So I figured if you can't beat them, join them. So I became a faculty member. And after a couple of moves, I have settled. And I think I'm going to be here for a little while. So I'm currently an assistant professor of educational technology in the School of Teaching and Learning at University of Florida. I did not do the name of this institute. I was added to it. We call it IALT. It's the Institute for Advanced Learning Technologies. It's a brand new innovation research incubator at University of Florida. And we are currently working on coming up with our mission statements and all that fun stuff. So because I am a true academic, I had to make a long title, and one of my colleagues had a really long title for his lab. So I wanted to one-up him. So I made up my lab, which is like super meta because it's ideate is what it spells out, which is also the third stage in design thinking, which is also a core part of the lab. So like there's all kinds of stuff going on right there. If that doesn't blow your mind, then I'm not the nerd for you. So that's basically what my background is. So without further ado, let's get into it. So as the title suggested, more than meets the eye. So one of the things that's really important when we're looking at distance learning or education in general is perspective matters. So these are 4 images, and depending on what your perspective is, you may see things a little differently. You may see the duck in full color. You may only see the top part of the duck. Oftentimes we work with faculty or we're instructional designers ourselves, and we run into these challenges where people think that our life is easy. Oh, teaching online is easy. No, everyone can do it. There's no work involved with it. And that's kind of like the duck above the surface. It looks, everything's real cool, calm, and collected. But as many of us know, our legs are churning quickly underneath it, right? So it's all about that perspective. So you've probably seen an image that looks like this before. It's the traditional factory model view of the education system, where basically everyone starts on the far right. They come in and they come out. It's the same. We follow the same protocol, same processes. We literally are stamping out creativity and discipline and intelligence. We just want everyone to look the same and come out, go in one way and come out the other way. But all of us know that's not really the case, right? So the education system is super complex. So this is just a world that I found that just sort of shows all the different stakeholders, things involved, what it means to be in education. It's overwhelming. You're looking at this world and it's like, oh, it's too much. But that's really how we feel sometimes being in this system. So there's a continuum, a pedagogy, andragogy, heutagogy continuum. And I think it's very helpful as we sort of start to think about distance education and distance learning. And I want to conceptualize this and reconceptualize this rather as about learner autonomy. So to sort of help understand the differences between these three terms, at least two of which you're probably familiar with, let's think about a learning management system and let's think about how we deliver our content in a learning management system. So if we're using a pedagogical approach, that's going to be a learning management course that's been created. And the course is very structured. Students start at a certain date. They cannot see past week 3. If we're on week 1, everyone's on week 1. So it's very structured. So there's a low amount of learner autonomy in that situation. Then we move into an andragogical approach. Now with this one, it's going to be a little bit more open. There's going to be a little bit more learner autonomy. There's still going to be structure to the course, but what's going to end up happening is that the students are able to see the full course. So even though we're on week 1, they can actually see up to week 5, and they can kind of submit assignments early if they wanted to, but we're still kind of going through at a pretty structured pace. And then the final one is heutagogy. And with this one, we have the most learner autonomy. This is what is commonly seen in maybe a self-directed course, where basically the entire course is open. Learners can pick and choose what they want to do. They can complete their activities. Now, while this sounds great, we also know that it has a lot of challenges with something like this, because students often are not able to self-regulate their learning. Even though they're going to be in the self-directed, self-determined learning, they may not be prepared for it. So we have these challenges. We also have accreditation issues, because it's a lot harder to prove that learners have reached certain learning outcomes if they're able to pick and choose and move throughout the course. So this can be a challenge. Another issue that we see is we have what's considered these competing learner needs, particularly with adult learners. So we have some learners who are looking at education as a way for career maintenance. So for instance, it may be that we've been an instructional designer for 5 or 6 years, but it turns out that, hey, in order to keep my job, I need to have a certain credential. So I'm gonna go back to school to get that. And then we have others who are looking for career advancement. So let's say you started at the help desk and you really want to be an instructional designer, but the instructional designer requires a master's degree. So you're going back to school for that. So the challenge with this ends up being that when you have 2 types of learners with competing interests going into the same course, it can be a challenge for the instructor to figure out how to meet those needs, because the way you meet the needs for a learner with career maintenance in mind is completely different from someone who has career advancement in mind. When you talk to faculty, oftentimes we'll hear this distinction when we'll say, the students aren't interested in doing research. They're just here to get this grade, or it's a prerequisite class, so they're not really engaging with the content. And that's when we have these conflicts between career advancement and career maintenance. And with the hat tip to Dr. Doucet and Dr. Stefaniak, I thought it was appropriate and necessary for me to bring in the crown prince of anarchy. And he has this quote in the movie and this concept of you introduce a little anarchy and you upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos. And he's an agent of chaos. So if any of you have watched the Batman movies, you know that the Joker represents complete pandemonium and chaos. And Batman is seen as the arbiter of justice in a way to kind of bring settlement to this chaotic thing. But relax. I know it seems like a lot, like you're freaking out, maybe there's all this chaos. There actually is a way that we can look at this system and figure out a way to make sense of it. Now, for those of you who are in the ed tech field and intimately aware, when we hear chaos theory, there's often discussion of Dr. Charles Regeluth. So he has done a tremendous amount of research specifically about chaos theory and looking at it within educational context. But it's also possible that your chaos theory information is coming from the venerable Dr. Ian Malcolm, who gave a wonderful discussion of chaos theory in the first Jurassic Park in 1993, when he explained that chaos deals with unpredictability in complex systems. So I say all that to sort of as an introduction to sort of move into what I am presenting as this transformative approach to academic credit. Because as we said, we had this factory model approach where we have what is considered the traditional student. Traditionally, education, higher education in particular, was seen as you're going to college for 4 years, you're doing 15 hours of classes a semester, you'll be done, and you go and get a job, right? But we also know that in our current environment, that's simply not the case. We have an increase in adult learners. We have an increase of working professionals who are going back for undergraduate degrees, going back for master's degrees, going back for certificates. So we need to take a different approach to how we handle academic credit, because our system is based off of someone sitting in a classroom face-to-face for 15 hours a week. And that's simply not what's happening as commonly as it did, as it happens now. So this is an adaptation of Dr. Regalu's chaos theory. So the first stage is what's called coevolution. So what we have is we have adult learners specifically looking for online learning. So one of the things that we saw in the global recession, I think it was in 2008, 2009, a lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of adults went back to school because they either lost their jobs and had to shift careers, or their jobs were becoming more technology proficient and they need to improve their own skills. So what we have is we have this increase in online learning. We have this increase where when I started school, it was seen as like, oh, you can take one online class, whereas now we have entirely for-profit online institutions that are built around this entire model. So we see schools such as Capella, University of Phoenix, that are really trying to reach these adult learners by offering online learning. So we start to see a co-evolution into how academic credit is achieved, because now we see a lot more of it achieved in online context. And then, around 2012, 13, we start to see this, what's called this disequilibrium and positive feedback. So we see all these learners going for online learning, and then we start to see the development of MOOCs. At the time, MOOCs were really seen as like, oh my goodness, this is going to change the world. This is going to completely topple the entire higher education institutions. Everyone's going to stop going to brick and mortar schools, and they're all going to go and want to do MOOCs. We found out that was not quite the case, but we did see that there was a tremendous interest and attraction to MOOCs, because the MOOCs offered so many opportunities that were just simply not available to those that were strictly confined to brick and mortar classes. So then the next stage is that we start looking at this credentialing and lifelong learning. So there was a recent systematic review of MOOCs. I believe it was published in 2020 or 2021. And it says that right around 2015, 2016, we start to see a shift into MOOCs looking at the credentialing. So what ended up happening is MOOCs realized that, hey, people just simply aren't going to go to a MOOC just for the fun of going to the MOOC. It's great to say you went to Harvard and did a MOOC from Harvard, but what does that actually mean, right? So we start to see credentialing. We start to see Coursera, edX, other platforms starting to think about ways to monetize this MOOC experience. And in the final stage, and what we're at right now, is we are at this transformation step as relates to academic credit. So what the thought is we've got going from the coevolution to the transformation. Is there a way that we can figure out a way to change the way adult learners are able to earn academic credit by leveraging some of the opportunities that are afforded for MOOCs, the credentialing that we need for academic credit, and then ultimately earn that academic credit? Is there a way that we can do that? And edX thinks they came up with that, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So there's a term that I've created. It's called Meso Credential. The paper is getting ready to be published in Distance Education. There is a link at the bottom. If you do that, I will share a couple other times. Basically, as we all know, papers are behind paywalls. So if you fill out this request form, it gives me your email address. Once the paper has been published, which should probably be in the next month, I'll be able to send you a copy of the paper. So micro-credentials, you've all probably heard of this concept. So micro-credentials are badges or certificates of completion. So some good examples of these would be things such as you went on LinkedIn Learning, which used to be lynda.com, and you completed some training on PowerPoint efficiency. Or you want to learn R, so you completed a micro-credential with that. Micro-credentials are great, but one of the challenges with micro-credentials is there has to be some value that's placed by another agency to make that micro-credential of value, right? So for instance, if any of you are teaching a class or you're working with faculty, if I'm teaching a class and I'm teaching a multimedia development class and a student submits a micro-credential they earned on LinkedIn Learning for PowerPoint, I don't give them academic credit for that. I don't say that, hey, you don't have to do this assignment. I could, but typically we don't. We typically say, that's great, you got those skills. I still need to do this assignment within the course. So micro-credentials are great. We see there's been a lot of research. Colleague, Dr. Richard West from BYU has done a tremendous amount of research on micro-credentials. So then we have what I call macro credentials, which many of us are familiar with. So these are those academic degree programs, right? So this is your master's degrees, your undergraduate degree, your PhD, EDD, certificates. So what has happened, and what this graphic is showing as a representation, is that we have a gap, right? Because traditionally, there's not a clean way to go from those micro credentials into the macro credentials. And this is actually one of the issues that we saw with MOOCs and continue to see with MOOCs, is that there's no value to completing a MOOC, because it's great that you got that certificate to say, hey, I did this MOOC from Harvard, but how does that translate to something? Who puts the value on that? So that is what I have termed the Meso Credential. And literally the Meso Credential is sitting between the macro and the micro and the macro level. And what this Meso Credential is, it's about academic credit for MOOC achievement. And what this is able to do is literally able to bridge that gap. And suddenly it changes that motivation from, hey, I completed this micro credential from Harvard. Wow, if I do several of these, I can get academic credit. Now I might be more motivated to complete that MOOC. So there's 4 stages within what I term this Meso Credential learning process. The first is higher education institutions have to create this course. So they have to offer a series of MOOCs, and they have to say that they want this MOOC is being offered. And ultimately this MOOC, if you complete this, we are kind of putting our stamp on it, right? Sorry, I was just checking the chat, make sure there weren't any missed questions. The next stage is that once this institution has made these 4 to 6 MOOCs and set the requirements, the learner then has to pass each of the MOOCs. So they essentially still earn that micro credential that they're familiar with. They meet whatever the requirements are within that MOOC. There's going to be learners who are in the MOOC who aren't interested in the Meso Credential. There's going to be learners that are interested. So they're all still mixed into that same platform. They're still interacting the same way. The only difference is that they are going to earn a micro credential when they've completed that. So they need to complete each of the MOOCs that are part of the program. And then after they have done that, the institution that's offering this will set some type of achievement requirement. So that could be a capstone exam that they have to take. In order to be eligible to take that capstone exam, you have to show that you've passed the 4 required courses before, or you complete a final project. So the final project is often in courses such as design thinking or some of the instructional design courses, just the courses that you don't necessarily want to do a capstone exam for, you want to see them demonstration of knowledge. And then the final step is if a learner is able to do each of these things, they passed all 4 of the required MOOCs, they successfully complete this achievement requirement, they now earn what I'm terming a Meso Credential. And this Meso Credential is then able to be applied towards a traditional academic program. So there's 2 types of ways that these programs are working right now. On the left, we have institutions that are offering a Meso Credential. So that could be a MIT, a Harvard, Georgia Tech is saying we're offering a Meso Credential in statistics. So anyone who passes these 4 courses that we're offering that are taught by our instructors is going to then be an opportunity for you to earn this Meso Credential, which may have some value. And Amber asked a question, sounds like barriers for registration might be removed or made more commercial. So yes and no. So one of the things about these programs is they are typically on average, I believe the average is about $1,600 to be enrolled in one of these credentials. And it typically earns you between 6 and 9 hours towards a master's degree. So that's a tremendous value if you're able to do that. It's particularly helpful for adult learners who don't know what they want to do, don't know if they want to commit to a master's program, a situation where maybe like they're worried about the GRE scores, they're worried about their work-life balance, they don't want to move somewhere. It's an opportunity for them to do that. It's an opportunity for you to experiment. There's a lower barrier of entry because it's still a MOOC. So you still have those opportunities to sort of come in and go as you please. So there are definitely some potential values to that. Sorry, just checking the other chat. Yeah, and the comment is about the monetization of the programs. That's definitely what's happening. One of the things that we look at as we're looking at this through chaos theory, we have to also remember that someone's got to make some money, right? There's still a cost of doing business. And the one thing about the MOOCs, it doesn't have the free word in it, right? It doesn't say free massive open online courses. It's just simply a massive open online course. So there's still infrastructure challenges. There's still instructors that have their faculty load that has to be compensated for. So we do still have some needs to cover those costs. However, these particular programs are opportunities to potentially lower those costs, particularly for the learner. Another set with the programs are what I'm terming institutions that are accepting the Meso Credential. So in this case, there are some institutions right now that are like, look, we think Meso Credentials are amazing. We think it's a great way for providing some more equity and access to adult education, but we don't want to invest our time and resources into offering these courses. However, we will take those credits and apply to our own master's degrees, right? So what this is allowing, it's allowing the reach of these Meso Credentials. So for a learner, potentially, you could go and complete the Meso Credential that's offered by MIT, but then you could go get your actual master's degree from Rochester Institute of Technology or Northwestern Institution. So it's really potentially a great opportunity. For an institution that say maybe doesn't have the infrastructure to support developing the course, but wants to improve their access, this is a great way that they can simply say, hey, we will accept that credential, because what you're doing is you're using the name recognition from MIT. So if I'm teaching a statistics class, I know that MIT is a legit school. It's going to be a hard program. So if a student can pass those 4 MIT offered statistics class, I know they can do well in my class. I'm going to allow them to do that. There's also, the reason why I have it as an overlap, there are some institutions that are doing both. So for instance, Rochester Institute of Technology does definitely accept Meso Credentials from other schools, but they also offer their own Meso Credentials. And so there's a combination. So you do see some overlap between the different institutions, what they're doing. Yep. So Linda mentions about eCornell. So there's definitely a lot of things, and that's why I say, and I've defined Meso Credentials around the MOOC aspect. I did that in part because I really wanted to distinguish between a school that simply said, we're going to move our introduction to psychology class online, and if they complete the class online, that they get academic credit, because that's not really the same, right? Okay. And Amber, we are on the same page, and we will discuss that coming up. Let's see. So an answer to Randall's question. So the reason why the institutions need to create these as a Meso Credential, under the Meso Credential definition, is because of that academic credit component, right? So there is a process in place, and that's why it's at the institution level, not say Google. Now, it's possible that there may be other programs that are developed, like Google may be doing some workforce development work and maybe offering some credentialing for their learning platforms, but that's different. There's also other programs. So Coursera has a program called Master Track, but I do not consider that a Meso Credential, because the Master Track is essentially just the master's program for the institution, just in smaller chunks offered online, as opposed to if you do a Master Track from Georgia Tech, you can't then apply that credit to a master's degree at University of Maryland. So that's a key distinction between the two. And all these things are discussed in the paper. So if you send me, if you fill out that form that I provide the link for, and I'll bring it up on the screen a little bit, happy to share it with you. That sort of discusses that distinction in a little bit more detail. So currently, like I said, we have two sides. So currently, the best example of a Meso Credential is offered by edX. They trademark the term micro masters and micro bachelors. A key distinction between Meso Credentials and why micro masters and micro bachelors are an example versus, say, the Coursera Master Track, as I mentioned, is that this is all about that portability of that academic credit, right? So basically, with a Meso Credential, you can learn from one institution, and then you get, like, it's an articulation agreement, if any of you are familiar with it, very similar to what we see with state institutions and community colleges, right? So if you complete this course at X institution, we'll give you credit at this other institution. And that's what distinguishes Meso Credentials from some of these other programs, because they don't allow that portability. So there's currently 58 MicroMasters programs that are offered by 32 institutions. So I saw an earlier comment about it's a system that relies on elitism. It is and it isn't, because there are no restrictions to what institutions offer these credentials. And there's also no restriction on what institutions accept these credentials, right? So there potentially is the opportunity to open things up and make things more accessible. Another thing that we do have to keep in mind is we do also have to always acknowledge that there's some that just do things at a better level and more efficiently. And if we can figure out ways to leverage those that are doing things more efficiently and making sure we can connect it with the people who need those resources, that's something that we always want to strive to do. Not always going to be perfect. There's always going to be some hiccups along the way. So we have these institutions that are actually offering Meso Credentials, and we also have, as I mentioned, the institutions that are accepting Meso Credentials. So there's several, I gave several examples here that are accepting the MIT Statistics MicroMasters. Now, the Micro Bachelors is a new program that edX just started. It follows the same concept as the MicroMasters. The one distinction with the Micro Bachelors is there's only one institution that currently accepts that. Elena, that potentially, there may be some bias. I don't know that there's going to be so much bias, because there isn't going to be, so going back to like that learning process, the institutions are accepting these credentials from the different schools, right? But you're still actually enrolled in a traditional master's degree program. So there isn't a distinction between, okay, these students went to MIT, so therefore they're in a different program. They're all, ultimately their learners are all coming into the same program. What you're doing is you're basically just you're getting some of that foundational knowledge covered through a different institution and being able to transfer that in. And it's as I said, it's a transformative approach because we haven't typically done that. And most master's degree programs are not accepting credit from other institutions. And also, it's very hard sometimes to know about that ahead of time, right? So with what's happening with this is that students are going into the start of their program, the Meso Credential program, knowing that credit is actually going to count towards that degree and knowing exactly how many credits they're going to count for, and they can sort of map out and they get a little bit more of that learner autonomy. But of course, when you create a new term, what was it? MicroMaster's term wasn't even copyrighted until 2016. We're now in 2022. So it's been very little time. So a couple of things that we will see and want to discuss is there's a tangible value to completing MOOCs now. So previously, people were like, so what? Why do I want to take this MOOC? What can this MOOC do for me? So a Meso Credential is an opportunity to create some of that value, right? You complete these 4 MOOCs, I'm going to give you academic credit at these different institutions. So there's some value towards that. We also have to keep in mind that enrollments are driven by student interest, and students are always going to be interested in improving their skills, maintaining, upskilling, all kinds of different things. So we're still able to see that, but now we have something for them to work for. And we know empirically that learners will do better in a course if they have a tangible goal and something to work towards, right? So they're interested in the content, and now if they complete the content, there's some value for it. And that will adjust how we conceptualize and look at these MOOC completion rates. So a research angle, and one of the things that I'm looking at right now is I'm looking at this learner intention fulfillment. So learners that said they wanted to be in the Meso Credential program, they wanted to complete. Who are they? What do they do in the course? And what could we do from a pedagogical, instructional design, course facilitator way to better make it easier for them to reach those goals? What are they doing well, and what are they not doing well? And how can we better prepare them to be successful in these programs so they're able to reach and achieve some of these values that they're looking for? And then there are some potential for equity and accessibility. So it's not going to be perfect, but there is the potential that we can address some of the equity and accessibility to higher education. So for instance, there are situations, there are learners who are like, I would love to do this master's degree, but either I can't afford it, I can't move right now, I need something that's more flexible, but I really want to make sure that I'm getting a high value education. So a Meso Credential could be that opportunity for them. It could be that opportunity for a lower amount without having to do a GRE prep test, which we all know is very biased, without having to do position statements, interviewing for a program. I can just take these courses, find out if I like the content, find out if I like it. How many times have we thought, oh, I wanted to be a lawyer, and I took some classes and said, oh, no, I can't do that. Or I want to be a designer, and it turns out, I'm not really that good at design. I'm more of a design thinker, right? So what this is going to do, what this has potential to do, is open that space up and allow people to explore a bit more. And if they do explore, they're able to then realize what's happening. But as an earlier question mentioned about looking at the data, this is all new. So one of the things that we really need to look at is who intends to complete the Meso Credentials and what are their backgrounds? What's their demographic? What's their what's the gender? What's their parents' background? Because in the social sciences, we've seen that parents' backgrounds tend to be predictors of success in higher education. But are there ways that we can figure out a way to better support those that may not have that background, maybe are that first generation type of learner? What are the scaffolding and supports that we can create within these huge open spaces that then allows them to reach those goals? And then specifically, what's happening for those that aren't able to complete? What are their backgrounds? How can we figure out different ways to work with them and figure out different ways to meet their needs? And ultimately, what are their needs? And then looking at workforce development. So the great thing about Meso Credentials is it does allow that flexibility for when and how these workers are going to gain these new skills and competencies. We know that. We know there's always been this demand for online learning, but there's not always the right structure for doing that. So this is not the end all be all. There are definitely multiple other options, other platforms, but this is simply another one to add, because the more options we can give, the more likely we are to meet these diverse needs of learners. So it might be that a Meso Credential is not the right fit. It might be that they need to do something with Coursera. It might be something more with Udacity. The point is that the more options we can give, the better ultimately we're going to be. So there may not be the right fit for you, but it could be the right fit for your colleague. And that's what we want to do, is look at these different ways and reshape the way we're looking at academic credit. And more importantly, take away that academic credit from being like, in order to get a bachelor's degree from X school, you have to sit in this class for 4 years, because that's simply not a realistic situation for a majority of people right now. So we got to look for different ways to sort of change that. And this also is going to really support that informal online learning. So we're going to allow for learners to explore. We're going to go back to, remember that continuum I showed about the learner autonomy. They're going to get a ton of control over how they do their learning, when they do it, how they go through these programs, how they navigate that within the program itself. So there's a ton of flexibility, a ton of informal learning that can happen, and it ultimately converts into potentially a formalized recognition in online learning spaces. So one of the research areas to look at are, where are the gaps in workforce development, and how can Meso Credentials fill those gaps? What could we do that would make this more adaptable and expand the reach? And then finally, let's look at adult learners. So one of the things, and one of the areas that I'm researching is alternative pathways to academic credit, right? Because we need to think outside the box, we need to be transformative, we need to really change the way we're doing things and figure out ways that we can meet learners and give them multiple options and figure out different ways to do it. So one of the things that I want to research in this space is who's taking advantage of these pathways. Are MOOCs the right vehicle for the pathways? It's possible they're not the right vehicle, that it's not the MOOC part, but it's more the openness stuff, right? It's more of the allowing a group of people to get together. What's that look like? And where are the barriers, and how can we remove them? So these are the core questions that we're looking at. So I see a couple questions in the chat, and I know we have a couple minutes, so I want to open up if there's any questions. If you go to this bit.ly address, Meso-request, it will give me your email address, and then I will send you a copy of the paper. I know that a lot of times papers are behind paywalls, so the paper should be published, I believe, in May. It's actually a special issue with Dr. Stefaniak, so we're kind of bringing it all full circle. And thank you for your time. If there's any questions, feel free to add them to the chat or unmute yourself, and I will check. So Dave asked a question.
Dr. Moore, could you read that question out, please?
So Dave is asking, these sound like a rebranding of the 12 plus credit certificate programs offered in higher ed, or maybe an evolution of them. How do Meso Credentials and MicroMasters differ from certificate programs offered by higher ed institutions? So the key distinction is really about where this instruction is happening, right? So with those certificates, this is not replacing the certificates that are currently existing. One of the couple key differences, one, those certificate programs often are only accepted within an institution, right? So for instance, I know from the faculty perspective, we have a certificate in learning analytics, right? And then you can apply that certificate towards our master's degree, right? Typically, if you get a certificate in learning analytics from the University of Florida, you typically aren't able to apply it towards a master's of educational technology at NC State, right? There's typically not that portability, right? So that's one of the key distinctions with the Meso Credentials, is that Meso Credentials are recognizing those articulation agreements and essentially creating articulation agreements that you create this credential, you earn this credential from one school and can apply it at another school.
Dr. Moore, I received a question that I'd like to read to you.
Okay.
How do you see micro-credentialing working with vocational or technical schools And do you see if there is a crossover between the two, understanding, right, that sometimes a technical or vocational school does have a set of English and things like that that the students must take,
Right.
but then they grow their skill set a little bit differently. So how do you see that working there?
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things when I was, thank you for the question. And as I was conceptualizing what a Meso Credential was and looking at it, that was one of the reasons why when I conceptualized what the definition is, it's specifically academic credit, right? Because I purposely made that more open. The concept and what constitutes the Meso Credential is that it needs to be MOOC based, right? And it needs to translate to academic credit. So vocational schools could very well be one of those schools on. So vocational schools those are typically like community college level, right? Is that vocational school?
There could be vocational, there could be vocational programs within a community college. Just so understanding, let's take that, let's bring community college in, right? They're not the Ivy League schools, they're not the bigger schools or anything like that, that we've covered. So let's look at the smaller schools. Yeah.
But so I guess the distinction is that they're more 2-year degree programs, right?
So vocational schools are they're more technical in nature. They are typically 2-year. They do come out with a certificate, but there are some minimum standards of writing and things like that that they must take because they have to communicate in whatever business that they go to. So yes.
So that would more likely be under the micro bachelor's programs because remember the micro masters are with the assumption you already have your undergraduate degree because it's for graduate credit. So the same concept holds true at the micro bachelor's level, right? So you could have a MOOC based off of improving writing skills, like an English 101 could be done as a MOOC, right? They complete all these MOOCs about writing skills that are set at that level. And that, as I mentioned, currently with the micro bachelors, there's only one school that's accepting it, but a vocational community college could be accepting that and say, hey, if you completed these English writing skills MOOCs and demonstrate your proficiency with writing and communicating skills or whatever, we'll give you 10 hours towards your 2-year degree or your bachelor's degree. So currently what's happened is, so Meso Credential is covering that MOOC-based learning to academic credit, but it's not graduate credit, right? It's any academic credit. So currently what's happened is that MicroMasters were first created in 2015. So they have a bit more development, right? The Micro Bachelors was created by edX because they started to see how successful the Micro Masters were. And they're like, wait, we got a whole bunch of learners who aren't eligible for a master's degree because they don't have their bachelor's degree yet. So could we create a similar process at the bachelor's level? And that's what they're working on right now. So there's definitely those opportunities for that space.
Thank you. Thank you for extrapolating on that. Do we have any other questions in the with the participants? You can either unmute yourself or you can type it into the chat and we'll read it out.
And for those of you, it's tricky on Zoom because I'm like reading the question and trying to answer. So if I haven't quite answered someone's question, please re-ask it again. I'm happy to.
Yep.
I think we just have a couple more minutes.
So here's one that just came to me. How do you see Meso credentialing, or do you see it being able to be a component for high school? So we know a lot of them, they take the advanced classes so that they can knock off some of that college work. So how do you see that maybe working in that environment?
Just so I'm clear, do you mean high school students earning?
So a lot of times in high school, yes, a lot of times in high school, the students will take college credit. And what that does, of course, it helps them later on because then they can just focus on the real classes.
So that's under that micro bachelor's credit, right? Because what ended up happening is, again, and that's one of the benefits of it being MOOC based, right? Because MOOC based is open, right? So you could be a 15-year-old you could go on there and say, hey, I'm going to do just like it works the same way we just talked about, like the vocational school situation, right? The same thing could be, hey, I want to knock out this English. And basically I'm going to, University of Maryland, some institution has developed and said, look, if you complete these 4 MOOCs, we will give you credit towards English 101 or 102, right? So a high school student hops on there when they're 15, 16, whatever it is, and they go, okay, I'm gonna go through, I'm gonna knock out these 4 MOOCs, and then it's gonna essentially be the replacement of that AP credit, right? Because the thing about AP credit is that in order to sit for an AP exam, you had to take an AP class. In order to take an AP class, the class had to be offered. I mean, it can be a challenge, right? So what this potentially can do is that's why I was talking about potentially about that equity, right? Because now all of a sudden you've got that really brilliant kid in Idaho that doesn't have the same resources as someone in DC, but they're just as smart and they're able to get on here, do these MOOCs and earn the same credit as that student who sat and took that AP exam and got a 4 or a 5. And the Meso Credential is very similar to the AP exam, right? Because with the AP exams, you do a bunch of work. The institutions aren't checking the syllabi of what you did in high school, right? I got AP credit, but University of North Carolina didn't ask for my syllabus from my high school. What they said is, you passed this exam, you got a 5 on this exam, we'll give you this credit. And a Meso Credential is the very same thing. It's the same concept. It's literally saying, you do this work and you reach the standard of the institution that is offering it, right? Then we'll give you credit. And it's just like that AP credit. It works the same. It works the same way. So again, it opens up that access, right?
Perfect.
It also, I mean, yes, it tends to be more elite institutions that are offering it, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because what this actually doing is that it gives us the potential that aren't able to pay for MIT and aren't able to afford MIT or Harvard because of how expensive it is. But let's say I go and complete their micro masters and pay $1,600. I have a MIT statistics micro masters that I can then go to any other school with. And they're like, oh, you went to MIT? Okay, good, we're gonna let you in. So it's actually combating the elitism, right? Because it's opening things up and it's allowing people to have more access to resources they would never have had access to before.
Cool. And we've got a couple of more questions that popped up. Casey says, I'm just wondering, who do I talk to at my institution about this? What did you call that agreement about accepting coursework for credit?
So you would need to probably you probably need to speak to the provost, director of online learning. Every school has a different structure. I would send them to the edX MicroMasters site, and you would need to do that. I would also recommend that you probably talk to some faculty first. So maybe find the faculty who would be potentially accepting it and get them on board and sort of go through that. There's not a specific person because it changes for every school.
Right. And then we have just one more question.
Yes.
How do we gauge which MOOC should be transferable and which shouldn't? Not all programs have equal rigor, placement tests, things like that. So very quickly, if you don't mind.
Yeah, real quickly, this again, going back to the AP example, that's not for us to determine. That's not our decision to make. That's why these programs are offered at the institution level. The institution decides what it is. The other institution looks at it just like we do regular articulation agreements. The other institution says, okay, based off of what this course looks like, I will give this amount of credit. So that's done at the institution level. That's not really for us to determine. That's how they kind of determine it. So I know we have to run. I try to answer every question. Contact information, feel free to send me an email or tweet me or request a paper. I'm happy to send it to you and answer any other questions. But we are running low on time. I talked as fast as I could.
Absolutely.
And also the last thing I'll say about this is all brand new. Like literally, Meso Credential doesn't even exist in the world. Like if you type it in, it shows like it says it's spelled wrong, right? Like it was literally created as part of this paper, which is getting ready to get published. So a lot of these questions are great, and it's transformative and it's groundbreaking. So you got like a sneak peek, rather, I should say.
Thanks,
Moore,
Rob.
this
And
is,
thank you everybody so much for joining us today. I know I speak for Dr. Moore. We wish you all well today, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your time at the presentations.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Dr. Moore, thank you again.